my duty to just simply to start the ball rolling and then hand over to the proper chair of this morning's session is Katrina Ruan. And
sorry, I'm not Katrina Ruan.
Oh, sorry, Katrina Crow. Sorry about that. But before that, there's just a couple of things to do in terms of announcements. Toilets are at the back, and at the stairs out there and down the stairs on the right hand side. Emergency exits are at the back and the front. There's an attendance sheet which was handed round last night, and I get the feeling that it went just about halfway down the body of the hall and then didn't go any further. So it's going to be circulated, but try and get it the whole way till we get, because we need the names and addresses for future meetings and so on. It falls on me to welcome Katrina as the chair of this morning's session. She's, as it's been described, she's a well-known face on media. She's been involved as the premier archivist in the country and former head of special projects. She is someone who we are very honoured and pleased to have to chair this morning's session. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Katrina.
It's a great pleasure to be here at the Jesuit Reed Summer School, which always maintains a high standard of talks and debates, and this morning's session won't be any different. We're going to have, I think, a very interesting conversation. In homage to the man after whom the school is named, I was looking this morning at my usual online sources, which is the way we all get our information these days. We just have to be careful about the fact that it might not be accurate. But interestingly, what I was reading was an article on the fact that people who work in places like Uber and Deliveroo and Amazon, the new Gilded Age firms of today, who are viciously exploiting their employees, are starting to fight back and are founding new unions and using the very technology which is used to control them to strike back at their rulers, as it were. And that gave me a huge amount of hope, because there has been a sort of despair of late at the decline of the trade union movement. And I suppose it's hopeful to see that it will spring up again naturally where people are being oppressed and discriminated against. So that's just a quick moment of hope before we start. The decade of centenaries through which we're making our way has many advantages for scholarship. The release and availability of high-quality archival material like the Bureau of Military History and the Military Service Pensions Files. The capacity to focus, as we're doing this morning, on particular years with their distinguishing characteristics. Plentiful conferences on a variety of historical themes: military, social, economic, gender and class. A public appetite for accurate, evidence-based and well-written history which complicates rather than affirms the received narrative of this fascinating period, and the steady production of excellent books, articles, radio and TV documentaries on the characters, movements, actions and feelings which changed Ireland so fundamentally. 1919 was a very interesting year, beginning with the Versailles Peace Conference, which arguably sowed the seeds of World War II with its punitive approach to Germany and many other Central European countries. In Ireland, the fruits of the 1918 December election resulted in the establishment of the first Dáil Éireann on the 21st of January, fulfilling the mandate given to Sinn Féin in that election. Also on the 21st of January, 2 policemen were shot dead in Solohead Beg, County Tipperary, without authorisation from the Irish Volunteers or Sinn Féin. They nonetheless became the first shots and fatalities of the War of Independence, and that conflict escalated slowly throughout the year. The Dáil proceeded to establish what was effectively a government on the run, complete with the first female cabinet minister, Constance Markievicz, who became Minister for Labour. They also raised serious money for a loan to support the government. The ingenuity and competence displayed by the government is extraordinary, considering the constraints under which it laboured, and it ran to a nascent diplomatic service which distinguished itself in Europe, the US, and as far afield as Argentina, and we'll be hearing about some of those diplomatic efforts from one of our speakers this morning. The year was marked by serious labour unrest with a number of strikes, the most impressive being the Limerick Soviet in April, brilliantly recreated in Mike Finn's Bread Not Profits, a site-specific piece of drama put on in Cleeve's old factory in Limerick on the anniversary of the Soviet. And it's a pity that that didn't manage to get a wider audience. It was difficult for people in some cases to travel down to Limerick, but it's one of the most impressive recreations I have seen of a really interesting moment in Irish Labour history. Labour, of course, had kept out of the 1918 election, getting the drafting of the Democratic Programme in return, which was then, in turn, watered down by Sean T. O'Kelly. But there was a very large constituency of working people who had plenty of grievances to express. Irish events took place before a restless international backdrop, with Europe, the Middle East and Africa being carved up at the Paris peace talks and others, revolutionary uprisings all over Europe and civil war in Russia. Irish politicians attempted to take advantage of that restlessness. Sean T. O'Kelly and George Gavin Duffy went to Paris with high hopes that they could press Ireland's case for independence at the peace conference, and this was one of the main platforms of the Sinn Féin election manifesto the year before. These hopes were dashed. Woodrow Wilson was reluctant to support Ireland against the expressed wishes of the British government, despite his 14-point espousal of small nations' right to self-determination. Eamon de Valera, President of the Dáil, having escaped from Lincoln jail dressed as a woman. I wish there was a photograph, but there isn't. It would be fascinating to see Dev, who was very, very tall. How did they get shoes that would have actually fitted his very large feet? That would have been convincing. He embarked on a lengthy tour of the United States to drum up support for an independent Ireland. The year ended with the attempted assassination of the Viceroy Lord French, not a popular figure, and the fatal wounding of the League of Nations due to lack of support from the United States. Some things never change. Ahead loomed the worst years of the War of Independence with the arrival of the Blackened Towns and the auxiliaries and the tragedy of the Civil War. In 1919, no one foresaw these eventualities, as we today don't know what the future may hold. Who among us would have thought a year ago we'd be watching this week the so-called mother of all parliaments disintegrate into the clownish displays that we saw there this week, and the gaping hole in the British establishment, which is the lack of a written constitution. At least we have one with all its flaws, so people know what to do if things go wrong. Over there, it's all meant to rely on the good chap theory of convention and tradition. And of course, when you get a shameless chancellor like Boris Johnson in charge, those things go by the board. Anyway, it's far more fun than it should be, and of course, it's all going to affect us very badly if things go wrong. We have two fine historians here today to look at this fascinating year of 1919. Donald Fallon is the author of a number of studies of the revolutionary period, including Revolutionary Dublin, a walking guide, a wonderful book if you want to walk around the city and see the major spots where things took place, and also a biography of Major John McBride, a very interesting and again complicated character who played a huge part in the 1916 rise. He is a former historian in residence with Dublin City Council and editor of the beloved Dublin history blog Come Here To Me. Rowan O'Donnell has written extensively on the Republican movement in Ireland and abroad, including special category, the IRA in English prisons 1968 to 1998 in 2 volumes of a meticulously researched study of Irish prisoners in English jails, Republican prisoners, over those crucial early years. His next book will focus on Saor Ulla in the early 1950s. He is a senior lecturer in the history department in the University of Limerick. And Donald is going to start us off by looking at the local situation in Ireland during 1919 with an emphasis on labour and social history. So Donald,
like I say, I do my wakest and Curragh Fetton Sean New. I'm very honoured to be here. I was supposed to speak at the Desmond Grieve School last year, and I managed to end up in hospital a few days before it, but here I am, a no better year to be here. It's a real privilege to speak on this panel with 2 historians I admire so much. I'm a great admirer of Katrina's book on Dublin 1911 and all the work she did with National Archives, making them so much more accessible to the public, and a great admirer of all Ruan has done, from his work on the United Irishman right through to more recent times. I want to focus today on 1919 in an Irish context. I think there's always a real danger for historians and for the public in reading history backwards. You know, for us, 1919 is synonymous with the events that played out at Solohead Beg, the beginning of the War of Independence. But in the contemporary press and looking at the files of today, I think labour unrest in the country was something that people were very conscious of 100 years ago in Ireland. And I want to focus this brief talk today on, I suppose, the labour movement social agitation more broadly, and what was happening in the country 100 years ago. Irish Labour in 1919 was nothing if not optimistic. And as far as Republicans were concerned, militant Labour could present both opportunities and potential challenges. And the years ahead would show that in the interactions between Dáil Éireann, the Labour Party, and militant workers. But still, 3 years on from May Day 1919, the delegates of the Irish Trade Union Congress were told that Labour's forecasts had come true and that the future now lay firmly in their hands. Quote, "We cannot afford to make many mistakes. The workers of Ireland have shown that they are responsive to the call, and this responsiveness on the part of the rank and file makes the responsibility of the leaders even greater. On all sides at the moment we see industrial unrest, and can we wonder at this? We have for the past 4 years been warning our people that as sure as morning the industrial war would follow the end of hostilities on the continent. Irish Labour's forecast has proven to be true." Looking back, 1919 in popular Irish memory is remembered for a January day on Dublin's Dawson Street and at Solihull Beg in Tipperary, when two very different but both revolutionary events took place. But incredibly, less than 20 lives were lost to political violence in Ireland in 1919, and it would be the following year before any major escalation in the military conflict. But still, I would argue 1919 is a decisive year in the Irish Revolution, not because of matters military, but broader revolutionary upheaval, the emergence of an Irish counter-state and the growing confidence and militancy of a labour movement which crucially viewed itself as in sync with its European counterparts and felt that opportunities were there should they want to seize them. International eyes and focus at the beginning of the year, eventually the international media would notice Irish Labour, but at the beginning of the year, international eyes were very much focused on one thing: the spectacle of Dáil Éireann, the realisation of Sinn Féin's electoral promise not to take their Westminster seats. The most significant document that was read before the first Dáil, in terms of political scope and ambition, was the Democratic Programme, a declaration of political, social and economic principles rooted in the material realities of the lives of Irish people and promising the sweeping away of the old order. I think even today, at the remove of a century, there's still a cutting radicalism in the Democratic Programme. It pledged that, quote, "It shall be our duty to promote the development of the nation's resources, to increase the productivity of its soil, to exploit its mineral deposits, peat bogs and fisheries, its waterways and harbours, in the interests and for the benefit of the Irish people." Going on to say that the nation's sovereignty extends not only to all the men and women of the nation, but to all its material possessions, the nation's soil and all its resources, all the wealth and all the wealth-producing processes within the nation. The document, as we know, was largely drafted by Thomas Johnson, Secretary of the Irish Labour Party, which had not contested the 1918 election. And that age-old myth that Labour were pushed aside and told Labour must wait doesn't hold true. Labour had made the decision of its own volition to step aside, allowing Sinn Féin a clear run in what became something of a referendum in Labour's absence. Johnson's original draft document had been somewhat toned down by Sean T. O'Kelly of Sinn Féin. Years later, Sean T. joked that his job was to de-Bolshevise the document. It's a difficult assessment to oppose, to be honest, when you read Johnson's proposed democratic programme. Words that didn't make it. The Republic will aim at the elimination of the class in society which lives upon the wealth produced by the workers of the nation, but gives no useful service in return. The democratic programme would later be dismissed famously by Kevin O'Higgins, a government minister in the early years of the Irish Free State and one of the 27 TDs who had been in the Mansion House, as largely poetry. But to other people it reflected a real and achievable radical vision of transforming Irish society. Unfortunately, most of the TDs who would have shared its radical hopes were in prison or on the run at the time. The famous dismissal of Kevin O'Higgins does leave an important question. Just how reflective was the democratic programme of the aspirations of Sinn Féin? And I think it's hard to disagree with the assessment of Brian Farrell, the broadcaster, in his book on the First Dáil. He said, "It did not represent the social and economic ideals of the First Dáil, in that many of its members had not even read the document in advance." Pierce Beasley, one of the TDs in attendance, who actually read the document in Irish before the gathered spectators, later recalled how it's doubtful whether the majority of members would have voted for it without amendment, or had there been any immediate prospect of putting the thing into force. Still, it was read, and that is important. For the Dáil, governance proved very, very challenging. The imprisonment of many deputies, coupled with the refusal of Unionist or Irish Parliamentary Party MPs, though they were invited to engage with the separatist parliament in any way, meant there were never really large attendances at the Dáil. And between the first Mansion House meeting and the truce, the Dáil would meet on only 21 occasions, only 4 of its meetings ever held publicly, the last one in May 1919. The outlawing of the Dáil in September 1919 brought about real further challenges as well. But in spite of the fact this parliament was criminalised and driven underground, they did succeed in establishing Republican courts and Republican police over large parts of the country. And people did reject the legitimacy of Westminster to intervene in their day-to-day lives of Irish people. When Irish people were given the chance at the ballot box to further endorse Dáil Éireann, they took it. And as Philip O'Connor rightly observed recently in a very powerful article, the Dáil received a boost in all subsequent local elections. Support for advocates of independence increased in municipal elections in January 1920 to 77%, in the rural council elections of June 1920 to 80%, and in county council elections that same month to 83%. All of these elections were held under a PR system designed to stunt Sinn Féin support. Now, how can an assembly like Dáil Éireann function in wartime? War gets in the business of politics. One local authority which pledged allegiance to Dáil Éireann wrote to them seeking financial assistance for a housing scheme, and they were informed bluntly that, quote, there are currently no funds earmarked for Irish housing. Local authorities must bear in mind the abnormal conditions of affairs prevailing in Ireland and endeavour in local matters to shoulder their own burden until the main cause of the abnormal conditions in this country foreign domination is finally removed. Much of the social upheaval that was happening in Ireland in 1919 and 1920 was beyond the control of Dáil Éireann. And indeed, questions of how to respond to sometimes sporadic social agitation and industrial action would raise real challenges and real debate inside the Dáil. In 1919, the first major industrial clash of the year did not happen in Dublin, but in Belfast, and it brought Ireland's industrial capital to a halt. As Desmond Greaves notes, Belfast engineers took unofficial action for a 44-hour working week in January. The strike spread from industry to industry. Gas and electricity undertakings closed down. Tramway men, textile workers, and finally the building trade ceased work in succession. Obviously, there were deep-seated social discontents, which Dáil Éireann would have been wise to scrutinise. What occurred in Belfast was a uniquely Belfast strike in many ways. And when asked by a Belfast striker if he was loyal to the King and the Union, the Scottish communist Willie Gallagher replied, "That's a stupid question. I'm a revolutionary and my only loyalty is to the working class." But the idea did exist in Belfast a century ago, that one could be both a unionist and a socialist. Despite all of this, the Belfast strike raised a lot of interesting questions. The Manchester Guardian newspaper, its report was filed from the thick of the action, would represent the first time that a British newspaper uttered the words Soviet in an Irish context. The Guardian said, "Soviet has an unpleasant sound in English ears, and we use it with hesitation. But it nevertheless appears to be the fact that the strike committee in Belfast have taken it upon themselves, and with the involuntary assistance of the civic authority, some of the attributes of an industrial Soviet." Any hope of working class unity in Belfast would quickly fade into the abyss of sectarian violence in 1920. But it wasn't Belfast in the north, but Limerick in the south, which would leave a lasting imprint on the consciousness of the Irish left from 1919 into subsequent generations. I think in the identity of the Irish left, the folklore, the mythology of the Irish left, the Limerick Soviet is so important. Writing later in 1919, the annual report of the Irish Trade Union Congress said that because of its dramatic suddenness, its completeness, and the proof it offered that workers' control signifies perfect order, the events in Limerick excited world attention, and they did. As in Belfast, it was the press and not the people on the ground who put the word Soviet into play. But the events in Limerick in April 1919 were nonetheless significantly more important from the perspective of Dáil Éireann than what had happened in Belfast. Here was a moment of direct action against British imperialism, taken by workers themselves, in opposition to the imposition of martial law. The entire administration of an Irish city, for the first time, had fallen into the hands of a trades council. Law and order was maintained. Limerick raised not only questions for the Dáil, but for the Labour Party and the trade union movement more broadly. And as Thomas Johnson's biographer notes, after a quick review of the situation, Thomas Johnson made the extraordinary suggestion that the workers should evacuate Limerick, leaving the British forces with an empty shell. The strike committee were nonplussed by the suggestion, as at the time they were in control of the city. Workers were supervising the operation of shops, controlling food queues and directing traffic. Some in Limerick maintained that Thomas Johnson and the Dublin-based leadership of the trade union movement more broadly had been inadequate in supporting their action. They believed in the need for a national strike, but I don't think Thomas Johnson was hostile to what happened in Limerick. I think he was just cautious, overly cautious, as Labour could often be during the revolutionary period. But it's amazing that only 1 year earlier he had penned an article entitled "If the Bolsheviks Came to Ireland," a front-page opinion piece for the union newspaper Irish Opinion, which struck a note I thought he would have heard ringing in what happened in Limerick. Thomas Johnson in 1918 wrote, "The Soviets, the councils of workmen, of peasants and of soldiers, who are now in power in Russia, could have their Irish equivalent in the trades councils, the agricultural societies, and dare we say it, the local groups of the Irish Republican Army. An Irish counterpart of the Russian Revolution would mean that these three sections would cooperate and take control of the industrial, agricultural and social activities of the nation. Power would no longer be in the hands of the wealthy, nor authority be wielded by the nominees of an imperial majesty. Industry would be diverted towards supplying the wants of the Irish people, and agriculture towards providing food for those engaged in industry." In the immediate aftermath of Limerick, Irish Labour was given a chance to show its teeth, and the May Day demonstrations of 1919 brought unprecedented numbers of Irish workers onto the streets. May Day 1919 internationally had very powerful connotations. It came after the death of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the defeat of the left on the streets of Berlin, the end of a brutal war on the continent, and perhaps most importantly, you could no longer be neutral on the question of the Bolshevik state. There was a time for the left all over Europe to take to the streets. In Glasgow, some 100,000 workers took part in May Day processions there, where they were addressed by Countess Markievicz, among other speakers, and newspapers noted the presence of many Irish tricolours in the crowd. The leading industrial union in Ireland, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, told their members to down tools and to show that, quote, "Irish workers join with the international labour movement in demanding a democratic league of free nations." A combination of factors, including wartime inflation, had swelled the ranks of the union in the immediate years before 1919. And a union that had some 15,000 members in 1914 could now boast in excess of 100,000 by 1919. The growth, in the words of one leading historian, was simply Lazarus-like. Across Ireland in May 1919, the ITGWU showed its strength. The members marched behind red flags, and in some quarters, and sometimes to the annoyance of local Republicans, local units of the Irish Republican Army marched beside them. That said more about local interrelationships, I suppose, than any official statement of political sympathy. But in Dublin, everything ground to a halt, leading the Irish Independent to describe the day as idle, dull and dismal. They also printed letters by 7 or 8 Dubliners complaining about how everything was closed in the city, all anonymous and thus probably fake. The Irish Independent reported that in Dublin there were no trams, no North Wall sailings, no theatre, no cinema, no electric power, no taxis, no restaurants, no pubs, no trains, except the Great Northern Railway. The regional demonstrations were also significant in scale. The Irish Independent reported that 3,000 people paraded in Bray, more than that in Wexford, and noted that, quote, in Killarney, soldiers joined in a procession of 1,000 people headed by the Father Matthew Temperance Band, an amazing spectacle for a May Day parade. In Clonmel, they said, several red flags were carried in the procession, notwithstanding police intimidation on the matter. These regional demonstrations of trade union strength gave a lot of cause for concern to the newspapers. The Irish Independent, ever reliable, said, "The display of the red flag by the demonstrators and the singing of the song associated with that flag. In these acts there is evidence, unfortunately, that the ideals of the continental socialists are beginning to penetrate into Ireland. That these Bolshevik doctrines should gain a footing in Catholic Ireland is much to be deplored." Now, one interesting dimension of May Day 1919 is how quiet Ulster remained. The city that had given Ireland the first major industrial unrest of 1919, Belfast, was totally out of sync with the national picture. Tens of thousands of people parade in Belfast that year, but they wait until the following Saturday, a day off, when they gathered in Ormock Park. And I think there was a real fear among northern workers of being seen to be used by what they perceived to be a nationalist-inclined labour movement. The Ulster Unionist Labour Association in Derry encouraged their members to go to work on May Day. And they said that the strike was, quote, "of a revolutionary and Bolshevik nature, supported by Sinn Féin propagandists. Don't be duped by Dáil Éireann. Repudiate such actions." What about the war? On a war footing, things moved very slowly in 1919. The men of Salahead Beg hoped to instigate a national war, but Dan Breen himself later recounted, "Sean Tracy said to me that the only way of starting a war was to kill someone, and we wanted to start a war." Ultimately, any revolutionary army worth its salt can't be led on the instinct and emotion of a handful of men, but on its ability to fight in the field. 1919 witnessed the significant rearming of the revolutionary movement, which wouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past, and they were not going to march into the next battle carrying 50-year-old Mauser rifles, as they'd done in the 1916 Rising. Throughout 1919, the Republican movement was rearming itself, often with the support of Labour. In the docks of Dublin, things were moving apace. The Bureau of Military History witness statements are fascinating insights into what was happening among dock workers. Hugh Early, who was the commandant of the IRA's Liverpool battalion, talks about the remarkable work that was being done by workers in Liverpool smuggling arms into Dublin in 1919. Citizen army men and union men, such as Thomas Leahy, were crucially important in this work as well. Tom Leahy, who had actually fought in the Rising as an Irish volunteer and later joins the Irish Citizen Army, remembered, quote, "We made train wrecking tools, hand bombs, and everything else that would be handy and useful when it was required." 1919 demonstrated that the war in Ireland, which was heating up, was going to take very different forms in urban and rural terrain. In Dublin, clandestine counterintelligence work was beginning to reap rewards. The Dublin Metropolitan Police G Division, based a stone's throw from where we're standing in what's now Pearse Street Garda Station, intended to monitor Irish radicals, was being quite literally dissected. Michael Collins brazenly even gaining access to the division's headquarters on one occasion. Soon, Dublin Metropolitan policemen were dropping dead on the streets of Dublin. On the 30th of July 1919, Detective Sergeant Smith, known with no affection whatsoever as the Dog Smith, was gunned down on the streets. Detective Sergeant Hoey would follow on the 12th of September 1919, two very feared men. Ruthless but efficient, the actions of the body of men around Michael Collins, known as the Squad, would bring a new kind of targeted war to the British state at the heart of its operations. Collins himself later noted, "Our only way to carry on the fight was by organised and bold guerrilla warfare. But this in itself was not enough. England could always reinforce her army. To paralyse the British machine, it was necessary to strike at individuals outside the rank of the military. Without her secret service working at its top efficiency, England was helpless. Robbed of the network of this organisation throughout the country, it would be impossible to find wanted men." It was obvious by 1919 the war in Dublin would be very different from the war the flying columns would fight in the countryside. So what defines 1919? For me, it's a year of strikes, espionage and counter-parliament. That is all part of the story. And the real violence would unfold from 1920. You could joke that the Spanish flu was more likely to kill a British soldier in Ireland in 1919 than the IRA. But still, what occurred here a century ago was crucially important in the tale of all that was to follow.
Okay. impeccable, I have to say. I was working out if you were going to go on longer when I would bring to your attention, but no need to do that. Ruan is going to talk to us now about the international perspective of 1990.
A lot of what I'm going to say will intersect quite nicely with that. So this is actually going to work better than any of us dare have hoped, I think. As the situation in the GPO became untenable and the move to the Moore Street Terrace was taken as the final, I suppose, the last stand on the headquarters element of the Irish the Army of the Republic, actually, not just the Irish Volunteers. The Irish Citizen Army, Hibernian Rifles coming on and Fianna. Pearse reflected that they'd managed to hold out for longer than expected. He thought they could hold out for 48 hours, ultimately it was 6 days, and moreover, that any question about the distinct entitlement of Ireland to representation as an independent small nation in any post-war conference had been made with such clarity, despite wartime censorship, despite misinformation, that Ireland would be represented. So there was some sort of concept that whenever the Great War ended, Ireland would have some form of entree, and that would logically, given that it represented the will of the vast bulk of the Irish people, as was indeed ratified in the elections we heard about earlier, in December 1918, that would probably lead to us achieving nationhood. The armistice of the 11th of November 1918, as I'm sure you all recall, was a surprise to most people. The conditions under which it occurred are not something I get into today. Germany and Austria-Hungary were already complying with many of the demands that were enshrined in that armistice, which was an agreed cessation of hostilities and not a surrender, let alone an unconditional surrender, and a compact at the time, albeit under conditions of huge adversity, but no Allied soldier has set foot in Germany. Now, that meant that the expectations of the great powers, who had underestimated the success of the 100 Days Offensive, meant they weren't going to need a spring offensive in 1919. And I found it very interesting to reflect on the fact that the main bulk of the American war effort was targeted towards a spring offensive in 1919, and colossal arms dumps had already been laid in advance of that in the south of France, but it wasn't required. So many people were caught on the hop, if you will, when suddenly the war shuddered to a halt on the Western Front. Now, there were some aftershocks, of course. The war went on for 2 further weeks in Africa because Lettow von Vorbeck just would not surrender and had not been defeated for the entirety of the war. But eventually, in due course, it began to settle down. The election that took place, the first remotely democratic election in the history of these islands, involving for the first time the votes of women and the votes of men over 21, some under 21 with particular circumstances, meant that the Sinn Féin mandate, the Irish Republican mandate, was hugely endorsed. On the 18th of January 1919, what are known collectively as the Paris peace talks began. Now, those peace talks went on for several years. A lot of them were not held in Paris. Many of the most important ones were in the suburbs of Paris. The one that's most famous is Versailles, but Versailles was the one that specifically dealt with Germany. Now, at that point in time, this is 3 days before Solihull Beg and the Mansion House, the first meeting of the first Dáil. So let's just say that the people who are gathering in Paris, that from the great powers and ultimately 32 countries involved in it, it wasn't a good week. It was a too good a news week to have something as important as the first Dáil and the commencement of our slow-burning war for independence. Of course, they were found lacking, and as Katrina mentioned, one of the first of the 4 departments founded, quite presently and correctly, was the Department of Foreign Affairs, and Sean Teochiali, who features heavily in the history of the formation of the Irish Revolutionary Movement and the state in itself, was immediately dispatched to Paris. On the 8th of February 1919, he attempted to press the case with the American delegation for Ireland's separate representation. This, of course, was something the British naturally were resisting, not least because the Irish Republican Army at this point was beginning to stir. He was followed by George Gavin Duffy, a man of quite a rigorous intellect and legal training, who also features during the later treaty negotiations. Wilson could not and did not formally concede the Irish demands. Much of his private writing contradicts his public statements. You'll often read about Wilson's exasperation with Irish Americans, his exasperation with anyone who's hyphenated and all of that. The fact that his grandfather was from Strabane wasn't particularly significant for him, but he was surrounded by very significant Irish-born and Irish-American advocates, including the much underrated James Duval Phelan, former mayor of San Francisco, a very interesting and controversial man, who was then a Democratic senator for the state of California, whose father was the richest man in California, an Irish-American. The richest man in California, richer than Trump. 10 Trumps. It's quite extraordinary. He was a close personal friend of Wilson's, and people like Phelan are doing things that we don't often see in public. There's just echoes of it now and again. And many of the public statements are deliberately muted, and in some cases deliberately misleading and non-committal. Wilson in private did offer assurance he would try to do something for Ireland. He was hot and cold on it, but of course we now know something. He was probably dying. Certainly his health was failing, and he suffered a very significant reverse in the previous November 1918 during the midterm elections, where he lost control of the Senate. Now, losing control of the Senate before he was able to go to Paris, the first sitting American president ever to go to Europe, which tells you something of the significance of this matter, was a very big blow. Not just because of the votes in the Senate, but because the Foreign Relations Committee came under the control of Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, it's not just Lodge, but Lodge is the figurehead. We tend to focus on the chairs of these things. He represented the normal American position, which is that of isolationism from Europe. They had very little interest in direct activity in Europe. America was only emerging from a small power status to mid-power status, and has yet to become the superpower, right? And the Monroe Doctrine was still the dominant idea. They'll concentrate in the Americas. They were fighting in the Americas as recently as 1898, the Philippines, Cuba, and all of that. That was their area as they saw it. One might disagree, particularly for Filipino, but the fact of the matter is, the idea of sending troops to Europe was absurd, and only happened late in the war, and not in the way that was anticipated. Congress was favourable towards admitting the Irish delegation, and in March 1919 voted 261 to 41 to allow the Irish delegation to have a hearing. Now, of course, that did not happen, because other things were happening on the ground in Paris with the American delegation that meant it would be impolitic, and I'm going to talk about that in a second for the remainder of my time. The American Federation of Labour, which remains an extremely significant body of organised opinion in the United States of America, were also firmly in favour of, despite the British wishes, having Ireland's a direct representation. As Katrina mentioned earlier, there was also an Irish-American delegation. This is quite separate but linked. In a nutshell, this is quite complicated. The Irish Race Convention series, which goes back to I think 1880 in Chicago, had been a creation of Clan na Gael, the rebranded Fenian Brotherhood, the analogue of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ireland, deliberately. They were in a position to organise effectively in the Irish communities in North America, particularly the US. It's a front for the Clan, as was the Friends of Irish Freedom, and the Friends of Irish Freedom, with 200 paid up members during the Tan War, is the matrix that was used to raise all that money that came here. Now, there was interaction between the IRB and the Clan on the ground, most notably through people such as Liam Mellows and Harry Boland and other very notable figures. Larry DeLacy, a lesser known but important figure in California. The Congress in Philadelphia in 1919 appointed three very eminent men who are high standing and nationally known. Frank Walsh from the huge Irish community in Missouri, particularly around St. Louis and Kansas City, which is still about ethnically 25% Irish, believe it or not. Edward Dunn, ex-judge in Chicago, with the distinction of being not only the former Lord Mayor of Chicago, Mayor of Chicago, but also Governor of Illinois. Now, I'm not sure that's ever been replicated. It's very unusual to go from a mayoralty to a governorship in those days. Michael Ryan from Philadelphia, obviously all of these people deeply, deeply seated in Irish American politics. Now, they had more success than Shanti O'Kelly and George Gavin Duffy. They were able to address some of the lower committees. They were able to present the documentation. They were permitted, with the assent of Lloyd George, who later regretted it, to come to Dublin, where they addressed Dáil Éireann and met with the figureheads of the underground government. And they, of course, were working on behalf of the so-called Race Convention, which is really a cover for the Clan. And they were dealing with people who had slightly divided councils even then. John Devoy in New York, Joe McGarity in Philadelphia,
and Judge Daniel Patrick O'Halloran in New York City. Now, O'Halloran was a man with enough influence in America to get the American Republican Party to consider tabling pro-Irish declarations during their conventions, which was quite something. That didn't happen either due to infighting, but you get the idea. There's a lot of moving parts here. By May 1919, even though the American sentiment, insofar as it could be fathomed, was positive, there'd be no success in getting Ireland to burst into the scene. But this is a conference, so a conceptual conference. We get a series of devolved meetings, committee meetings, where the Axis powers were being dictated to, where the big four powers themselves were divided. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about that before I move on and conclude. Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, and there's a name you can get wrong very easily. Lloyd George was in a difficult situation. His electorate was now suddenly expanded, which meant that for the first time ever, really, governments were more responsive to popular pressure than before. Moreover, this is a government that now didn't simply have an expanded electorate, it had to deal with the popular press and populism that grew from that. Whereas jingoism and wartime racism was very useful for getting people to hate the Hun and all of that, the problem was once you let that out of the bag, what are you going to do? How do you get it back in the bag, right? It's not easy. The British people were led to believe that they suffered uniquely badly. That wasn't true. The countries that were devastated in terms of losses were Russia, Tsarist Russia, Germany and France. Now, that's not to say all the countries didn't suffer grievously. They did. And the losses in the UK and Ireland were very severe, accentuated the fact that so many had been conscripted to die, which had an emotive and a difficult situation. Many who died in the Western Front did not want to be there, had deliberately not joined in 14, 15, 16 and find themselves conscripted in 16, 17, 18. Right? This wasn't straightforward. There was U-boats, even though the British had a bigger submarine fleet, people focused on the U-boats. There were Zeppelins, even though that there was the Royal Navy was bombarding German villages using their strength at sea. They didn't see it that way. Famously, Sir Eric Geddes, the First Lord of the Admiralty, the man who took over, when Churchill's plan for the Dardanelles didn't go so well, said he wanted to squeeze the German Lebanon until the pip squeaks. Now, it's a cliche, it's often quoted, but that gives you an idea of the sort of populist sentiment that some British politicians and military figures want to play into. Demobilisation was a huge pressure. There were 3.5 million men in uniform in 1918. By November 1920, that dropped to 370,000. So you're going from 3.5 million to 370,000 in less than 2 years, which is pushing a huge number of men back into the workforce, which is stressed, albeit a workforce that's already been convulsed by de facto nationalisation of the coal industry, steel producing capacity and things like that. So Lloyd George had his own problems. Before anyone shot anyone thought it had Beg, and before people like De Valera escaped and became a very effective international ambassador of the Irish Republic. Franz Clemenceau. But Clemenceau isn't just Clemenceau. He's got to deal with Marshal Foch. And Marshal Foch wanted the proverbial Carthaginian peace to be imposed on Germany. In other words, to destroy Germany. Not just to attach Luxembourg to the German Customs Union, but to take large swathes of Germany, to permanently demilitarize the Rhineland, to occupy the Saar fields and the Ruhr Valley, which they did, by the way, and to basically reduce Germany into such a status that it could never fight again against the French. Because remember, and we tend to forget this, as recently as the spring of 1918, it looked like the Germans were going to win. As recently as that, there was dire threat to French national integrity. The Italians, under Orlando, had entered the war late in May 1915. Under the Treaty of London and other secret protocols, they'd been promised what we now call Croatia as a prize. They'd been promised Constantinople after the successful conclusion of the Dardanelles campaign, which didn't happen. The Russians had also been promised Constantinople, which would have made a lot of sense with the whole Black Sea setup. Incompatible, impossible. The Bolsheviks, of course, helped everyone out by deciding they didn't want anyone else's countries. Although some people would beg to differ, but basically speaking, the anti-imperialism of Bolshevism was such that they certainly weren't going to try and take Constantinople. And I'd like to see anyone try, by the way. The Turks proved themselves extraordinarily adept at repelling foreign interference. But Orlando also wanted Germanic areas, Austrian, of South Tyrol, of Istria, of Trentino. He wanted another port in the Adriatic at Fiume, which he didn't get. He didn't get Croatia, didn't get Constantinople, wasn't allowed to re-secure sovereignty over the Deccanese under Italian occupation, didn't get anything in Africa, so they stormed out the talks. Now, by June 1919, the Americans had been forced to abandon the talks because they weren't going to get anything that looked like what the 14 points was meant to be. And the American Senate didn't want anything to do with it whatsoever. The League of Nations did sort of splutter into existence, an excellent concept of a different type of collective security that was non-militarized, but the lack of militarization meant the French had no faith in it, which encouraged them to be harder on the Germans. The Russians were no longer available as a counterweight for a potential two-front war. So you get this sort of this destabilizing sprawl of disaster that produced the Second World War. The creation of Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, which the Americans had supported, did happen. And that's probably what they got. But to do that, you have to lose sovereign territory from Germany. You get a Poland where only 60% of the population spoke Polish, and other anomalies of that nature. Danzig gets sort of transferred, a corridor gets sort of arranged, because you can't give the Polands back Lithuania anymore. Because that's a different Tsarist entity, former Tsarist entity is going in a different direction. That's what they wanted. So, here's what did happen, and this is I'll keep this brief because there's so much could be said about it. You have to bear in mind of the financial investment, forget about the human investment, the financial investment of the great countries involved in the First World War. The countries that lost money are obvious. The British, now this is gold, these are gold losses, this is bullion, it's only one sort of factor, there's many other factors. 42 million in gold, Belgium 4 million, France 25 million, Italy 19, Austria-Hungary 55, which they weren't going back and they're losing their empire. Germany 123 million, they weren't getting back and they're losing 40% of the population in their industry. Now who got the gains? Who got the gold? Where did this gold go? Because it's actually physically transferred. Well, the Australians got 1 million, that's due to providing wool for uniforms. The Japanese got 183 million pounds worth of bullion. Now, that's the money they used to build the fleets to invade China and later to attack the Philippines and to attack Indonesia using mandate bases that they were given after the peace talks. More of that in a minute before I finish. The Swiss are owning up to having 12 million. Yeah, right. Holland 41, Denmark 9, Sweden 10, Norway 4. Iron ore, goods and services, anything you could produce close to those countries you'll be able to sell. Canada 9 million, and bearing in mind they were very heavily combatant and had a lot of expenditure, that's not a bad return on your money. But here's the critical one. United States of America, 278 million in gold bullion. 278 million in 1918-ish prices. This is why New York went from being an important financial centre to the financial centre. Now things keep going the way they're going to be. It might be the only one, along with maybe France and Hong Kong or whatever. Argentina 49 million, not bad going. Uruguay 10. This is the permanent change in the balance of fiscal power. And I'm going to bring in one more factor before I stop. That's certain losses. The Germans pre-war had legal, commercial and generally private entities all over the world. These are nothing to do with, I suppose, overt German imperialism, but one might say it has a hint of post-colonial issues, right? The ones they had in Morocco, in Egypt, in Liberia and China were all taken from them, including those that were entirely privately owned by German citizens and their property was stolen by the Allies. One concession in Kyoto, I think I pronounce it, was given to Japan. I don't think the Chinese would be too pleased with that. I don't think the Chinese would be too pleased that some of their trade concessions from the Germans, which were friendly, be given to the Japanese, who would then of course wage the Manchurian War against them. The Japanese received the mandates of the Marianas, the Carolines and the Marshalls. And these were the forward bases that we used in 1941 to attack Indonesia and to wipe out the Dutch fleet, amongst other extraordinary achievements. The Australians were given German New Guinea. Great, changed all the names. New Zealand got German Samoa, which is very good for a supply of forwards for rugby union. The British and the French then began to work together in a way that alienated the Italians. And if you want to know why the Italians switched sides, so to speak, and joined the Axis later on, it's largely due to things like this. The British and the French conspired together to jointly divide Cameroon, Togoland. The British decided, we'll keep East Africa. We like that one. Can we have that? Yeah, we'll have that one. The Belgians were aggrieved, so they got Burundi as a consolation prize, which was then landlocked, so it's not as important. South Africa, a new country that experienced an uprising in 1916, a conglomerate of several countries really, got southwestern Africa, German southwestern Africa, which the Germans had acquired using atrocity and horror, but nonetheless handed over to South Africa. One of the interesting things about the Paris peace talks is the Australians under Billy Hughes and Jan Smuts of South Africa were able to convince everyone not to raise the rights of indigenous peoples, which the 14 points had effectively insisted upon. Not just for their self-interest, but to raise their rights. So in many cases, the rights of people in places like South Africa were degraded by the fact they were given to places like South Africa. That you're going to be worse off in terms of legal status. So to conclude, basically speaking, where is the self-determination of small nations in this? It didn't happen. And just because you can create fashion Yugoslavia out of a bit of the corrupt, decayed Ottoman Empire, the non-Turkish part of the Ottoman Empire, and you can basically make things a bit better for some people, some places, that Warsaw did very well out of things, but other people didn't. No one gave the Ruthenians a country. Not suggesting they're analogous, but there were winners and losers. The small nations did not prosper, and in many cases things got much worse. Meanwhile, the Americans backed out of the talks, wouldn't sign, and never signed Versailles. Never signed Versailles. The Italians stormed out because they weren't getting anything, as they saw it, and this is why they attack Abyssinia later on. Mussolini begins his march from the socialism to fascism and things of that nature. The nuncio gets emboldened. The Bulgarian ultranationalists resisted. The Turkish ultranationalists resisted under Kemal Atatürk himself. You're putting in place things that destabilise the bloody world. Forget about Europe. So in that context, Sean Teo Kelly, wearing his best clothes, representing the just cause of Ireland for fair hearing, was facing an uphill struggle. The US could have been the guarantor for all of this, but they found it domestically impossible. Whatever the likes of Phelan, whatever the likes of Walsh and Dunn, etc., could have carried with them if they'd been backed by DC, was impossible to do so, for reasons that were nothing to do with the merit of the argument, or the popularity of the argument. One of the blowbacks of this, I'm going to finish up in a second, Trina, is that Wilson lost a huge block of his Irish-American support base and was defeated in the following presidential election. Another thing that hastened his demise. The War of Independence in 1919 was not formidable. If it had been formidable, there's a chance that Ireland could have been a special case considered in a particular manner. But that would have required other powers ganging up and are now financially devastated England. The British never recovered psychologically, monetarily, from the de facto defeat of their empire in 1914, 1918. I mean, they have a lot of places in paper, but the rot was setting in and we've come crashing down all the way through the 1950s. So in conclusion, we could talk about this all night, we would only be scratching the surface. The more I began to look at it, just to revise it from my own head, I realised how extraordinarily complicated it is. A lot of it is irrational and illogical and strange. The entire world was destroyed, not just during 1418, but also in 1919. Thanks very much.
And yet again, impeccable timing. I can't tell you how impressed I am with the two gentlemen here this morning. It is a great skill to be able to stick to the time limit that you're given for these events. And what an absolute panorama we've got from the two of them. Donald's exposition focusing largely on labour history, with lots of other things thrown in, which gave us a wonderful tour of what was going on in Ireland during 1919, and then Ruan's tour de force, explaining how all this fit into the rest of the world and what was going on during that year. And as I said at the beginning, one of the advantages of looking at single years, as we're doing during this decade of centenaries, is that we can get to that level of detail and inform ourselves in a much more detailed way about what was going on both here and elsewhere and how the two interconnect during these very crucial years that we've got. Okay, we have time for questions. I presume we're not under any pressure to get out of here, are we? Kevin, wherever Kevin is? No. So we'll allow maybe 20 minutes for questions. Who'd like to start the ball rolling?